honor, oops, sorry. It is my honor and delight to welcome Reverend Dr. Dreijer Hesline to join us today in this final of our four series, webinar series funded by the Louisville Institute. I first met, and I put met in quotes, Keiko about 2.5 years ago when she spoke at the Dubrick Institute as one of the invited keynote speakers. And there I listened to her talk about the value of women's voices, of women's theological imagination, and the importance of their stories in decolonizing theology. I remember being very inspired by her work and touched by her compelling narrative that she wove. A year later, when Alan and I were talking about who we might invite to join us on this journey of presenting and sharing the work of the Beyond Saints and Superheroes study, Alan immediately proposed Reverend Dr. Dreijer Hesline, and I was thrilled at the opportunity to work with her. I was even more thrilled when she said yes. And so we had the opportunity to present with her this summer. So I've had the opportunity to hear even more of her work and more of her ideas. And every time I listen to her, I am inspired, and I leave the seminar or the presentation with many thoughtful questions. I appreciate how she asks me to think more deeply about my own theology and how she pushes some of the ideas that I'm grappling with. It's very powerful. I'm very grateful. I know our project has been richer because of her involvement, particularly as she challenges us to think more deeply about God and disability and church. The Reverend Dr. Dreijer Hesline is the Horton Professor of Theology at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Saskatoon. She has been a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church since 2002. She is a deeply respected scholar, author, and frequently sought after presenter. And when I asked her to share what she did in her free time, and I'm amazed she has any, quite frankly, she shared that she fosters pets for the Humane Society. I am very grateful for her time, for her words, for her willingness to share her thoughts and her scholarship and her theological imagination with us today. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was a very inspiring introduction. I hope to live up to that. First of all, I want to say thank you to Laura and Alan and everyone that's been involved with the research project that has sort of resulted in the Beyond Saints and Superheroes. And to thank you for inviting me to give some theological reflection on this. I want to begin by acknowledging that my body and my heart is in Treaty 7 territory, and I live on this land with the other human and non-human bodies here. This land is shared with me by the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley nations of the Stoney Nakoda people, the Blood Tribe of Kainai Nation, the Piikani and Siksika nations of the Blackfoot people, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis of Alberta Region 3. So when the original survey came out from Laura and Alan, I did not respond, even though I am actually the mother of a child with an invisible disability. He has an executive function impairment that we often call ADHD. And I also myself live with a mood disorder, or what we might call an emotional disability. Now, since the survey was released, I have somewhat ironically come to experience what it is to live with a cognitive disability, or to put it more bluntly, brain damage as a result of COVID. This experience of being unable at times to even think has certainly informed my reflections and moved me to consider even more deeply how we conceptualize God and how these images impact our understanding of what it is to be fully human. So while I certainly resonated with much of what the respondents in the survey have said about the challenges of parenting and the lack of church support, as a theologian, I have been particularly curious that none of the respondents asked the churches to reimagine what it is to have or to be a human body, what it means to say that we are made in the image of God, or to wonder if disabled people are also made in the image of God, might we imagine a disabled God? And so today I want to imagine that a little bit and push that perhaps even further. So a disabled God is, of course, not my idea. It comes from theologian Nancy Easland, who established a framework for the conversation around spiritual care for disabled bodies that helpfully clarifies the difference between impairments and disabilities, where impairment refers to an abnormality or loss of physiological form or function, and disability is the consequence of the impairment. That is, an inability to perform some task or activity considered necessary. A limitation that is determined by what normal abled people can do. So her clarification is important for reminding us that many people have impairments, but not disabilities, if their environments are shaped to accommodate impairments. And in the survey conducted, I was particularly struck by this in the responses from caregivers who said that church could be too chaotic for their children due to sensory overload. And the contrasting responses from caregivers who felt or were told that their children were too chaotic for church. In both of those cases, the structure of the worship service, whether physically or liturgically or even relationally, turned the children's physical and behavioral impairments into disabilities. Orderly bodies, orderly minds, and orderly voices are considered necessary to function properly as a worshiper and to produce the desired worship atmosphere. To elicit those responses, churches are constructed to privilege those whose bodies are able to be still. Seating takes up the majority of a worship space, with little room given for those who have to move their bodies, or space given to unchoreographed movement. If you have ever gone the wrong way, returning to your seat after communion, you will have encountered the restricted space in the aisles. Worship time is structured with a linear order that does not allow for digressions, impromptu contributions, or spontaneous dialogue. Now, we describe these things with the word flow, as in the flow of space and the flow of the service, but we might also call them restricted, which is how they may feel to people whose impairments are not accommodated. However, that we generally talk about flow rather than restrictions is not surprising, as Easland points out that the discourse that creates disability is one where ability is normative. Disability is ability-centered. Ability, whether that is physical or mental or emotional, is the norm, and everything else is a deviation from that. Easland's goal, then, is to decenter abledness in several ways, two of which I will touch on today. The first is to see the relationality between impaired and non-impaired people as key to life for all. In an ability framework, everybody is able to take care of themselves, physically, mentally, emotionally. We teach and celebrate milestones of physical independence. My baby can feed themselves. Oh, my child got dressed for the first time. Even cleaning yourself. We also teach and celebrate milestones of emotional independence. Regulate your own emotions. Stop your own crying. Control your own temper. The same goes for cognitive independence. And this one I think is particularly challenging in academia. Think for yourself. In all of these areas, people who cannot achieve physical, emotional, or cognitive independence are described as actually dependents. Ability to be independent is the norm. Eastland, however, argues that rather than lifting up self-sufficiency as normal for human existence, we start centering the lives and habits of people with disabilities, particularly the other dependent nature of impaired human existence. She suggests that reliance on others creates webs of other dependent relationality that is essential and natural for being human. Now, theologically, the shift to thinking of humans as naturally disabled or created with disability requires reimagining what it means to be in the image of God. And more specifically, to imagine God as disabled. And so Eastland describes God in a sip-puff wheelchair, which is specifically a God who is completely physically dependent on others. And she argues that disability is how we are made in the image of God. As she puts it, the disabled God is God for whom interdependence is not a possibility to be willed from a position of power, but a necessary condition of life. I'll say that again. Interdependence is not a possibility to be willed from a position of power, but a necessary condition of life. Eastland rejects the idea of a kenotic God who is omnipotent but empties God's self to become a dependent mortal. A disabled God is not omnipotent in the way we understand power, not the rock from whom we get our strength. This God is one who needs others, who is essentially powerless, powerless in essence. Nor is this God the idealistic model of a healed survivor reaching down to lift up those who are still struggling, or a God who is impaired but able. This is a God who is still in need and struggling. Now, this God is, of course, hard to imagine. This God runs counter to our traditional understandings of omnipotence, and even to our understanding of God as the creator who calls forth light and produces the species of the world. This is an unproductive God who does not do anything. Crip theology, as a recent development of disability theology, invites us to explore this idea more fully. While disability theology looks at ways in which impaired people can be authentically welcomed into a culture historically shaped by ableism, Crip theology asks why that is desirable in the first place. Crip and queer theologian Karen Bray draws on her analysis of Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism to expose the conflation of abled bodies with Christian bodies with productive bodies, and points out, as we might gather from the title of Weber's book, that the Protestant work ethic is tied to a capitalist demand for productivity in such a way that to be a good Christian is to do and to produce. And in the Christian framework, such work is considered redemptive. As a consequence, impaired bodies, which cannot do much in an ableist environment, are considered the least productive, and therefore the least valuable and the least redeemed. In the spirit of Crip theology, however, Bray suggests that this mix of productivity, abledness, and God feeds a toxic system that drives even abled bodies into disability, because it demands even more and more production from the able-bodied and able-minded church members. Further, in a society where we are shaped by productivity, where we cannot make ends meet without producing something in the form of a job, and where the church subconsciously internalizes this productivity mindset, the inability or even unwillingness to produce is framed as immoral. Idle hands are the devil's work, goes the saying, riffing actually on Proverbs 16, 26 to 27. The appetite of workers works for them. Their hunger urges them on. Scoundrels concoct evil, where scoundrels are those who do not work. Now, this connection particularly struck me because of a comment from a respondent in Laura and Alan's survey from a parent who welcomes the church's help in caring for her disabled child, but feels badly that she is not able to help out in return. She can't do what a productive and valued church member is supposed to do: help on a committee, or volunteer with an event, or teach Sunday school. The exchange of productivity cannot take place, and her dependence on the church leads her to feel badly, less valued as a member of the church, maybe. And so we can deepen our query to ask, what is it about our churches and our theologies that creates an environment where disabled children are disregarded or excluded because they are the most unproductive of the unproductive? Children who are abled are already considered to be unproductive. Churches invest in children's ministries and complain when these children demonstrate a poor return on investment by leaving when they are productive adults. Children who are disabled are doubly unproductive, with no productive future to exchange for present investment. They are disenfranchised when they have disabled bodies, and even more when they have disabled minds. In the midst of comments to some of the parents of these children that their own children are too disruptive or disorderly, are uncontained and unproductive, I wonder nevertheless whether this disruptiveness and unproductivity is a gift for the well-being of the whole church. Bray, working through Sarah Ahmed's approaches in The Promise of Happiness and Willful Subjects, suggests that a stubborn refusal to get with the program breaks down the normativity of ableism that disables everyone. She says, a willfulness that opens up resistant action without intent might be a ground for a multiplicity of divergent becomings rather than a demand to be one way or another. We can only experiencing these multiple becomings, these multiple ways of being in the world, if we are freed from bondage to productivity, as it were. If we engage the liberation that can come from unproductivity and from living dependent lives. Grant McCaskill, who writes the book Autism and the Church, addresses the underdeveloped social skills of people with autism, pointing out that most people tend to value normality, to be drawn to beauty, and to value things with obvious capital value. They value those who demonstrate their worth by participation in the social world and performing well. These people, these normally abled people, have social capital, while those with autism are, in McCaskill's words, not always easy to like. They do not always bring social capital. They may have little utilitarian value. The same can be said for people with mood disorders, who are not always cheerful, or do not always lift up the mood in the people, or are not always inspiring, and yet they are liberating. Speaking as someone who has a mood disorder, there is a freedom in not having to be happy all the time. There is a freedom in being able to sink into lament or grief or sadness, to say, I don't feel happy, and so I won't be happy. I won't produce happiness. And so Bray talks about a willfulness of resistant action that I wonder if we might call anti-productive, anti-capital even, and therefore liberating. How might our freedom from productivity, whether that is physical productivity or producing happiness, how might our freedom lead us to actually enjoy our connections and dependence with one another? How might identifying as people made in the image of an unproductive God lead to being more fully human? Eastland's disability-centered approach, combined with Bray's CRIP resistance, invites churches to embrace a theology that actively disrupts our captivity to productivity, and hence to abledness. Bray calls this a theology of unproductivity. And I wonder if we might use it as a metric for church belonging and care. To what extent do churches care enough about their members to allow them, or even encourage them, to be unproductive? Now, one of the things that I wonder about the survey and why the survey respondents didn't ask the churches to challenge their images of God is that I wonder if they didn't do that because they are tired, exhausted even. It is exhausting to take care of children with disabilities, in part because it involves living against our culture of productivity. Medical appointments, physical care, emotional regulation, thinking for another person is exhausting. Add to that the energy required to assert a person's worth in the face of a society that deems them worthless, and the exhaustion is more than doubled. But as Bray asks, might the slowdown of exhaustion serve as a radical opening for radical thought? In other words, can theology embrace its own times of exhaustion? In the context of Laura and Alan's research, we might think of spiritual care as embodied, unproductive, and making room for exhaustion. This CRIP approach, grounded in a relational rather than productive theological anthropology, leaning upon an unproductive, uncontained, disrupted, exhausted God, might move the church from being a place where disabled families are welcomed, or not, to being a community of disabled bodies enjoying interdependent relationship together. An unproductive God can offer us freedom. Eastland continues to disturb our notions of what ability and security and self-sufficiency and productivity means by positing these things as negative and counter to the enjoyment of life. Her proposal of a needy God, in her words, debunks the myth of individualism and hierarchical orders, in which transcendence means breaking free of encumbrances and needing nobody, and constitutes the divine as somebody in relation to others. For Eastland and for others, independence is lonely and an uphill battle because it runs counter to our creation. We are created with limits, but to try to live as we are not is exhausting. Amy Kenny, who writes My Body is Not a Prayer Request, talks about our insistence on independence as a kind of self-denial. All of us are dependent on one another, she writes. It's simply that we've collectively decided which aspects of interdependence are more socially acceptable than others. We are all here dependent on Zoom, but do any of us know how to repair our own computers or code our own apps? Does that bother any of us? We are utterly dependent on others to keep us connected virtually, and yet this is acceptable. And yet we look down on those who keep us connected physically, as if it is abnormal to need nurses or physiotherapists or medical aids to keep us in physical spaces. But this cognitive or perhaps subconscious dissonance is exhausting. Pushing others away constantly, striving to mask our need for help is exhausting. Acknowledging our created relationality is then freedom from this pushing and striving. It is liberating. Joy then comes from living into, rather than running away from, necessary interdependence. Value comes from simply being, not from doing. This is not a new idea, of course. When we think about the importance of the seventh day of rest in God's creation, or when we consider Jesus' parable about the laborers being paid the same, whether they worked all day or only at the end. So I'd like to read this parable, and as I do, I invite you to listen with an ear for unproductivity. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. Now, we know that the laborers then argued about wages and what they deserved based on their market productivity that day, but that is not how the landowner chose to value them. They were valued completely apart from their productivity, with the unproductive valued as much as the productive. Might this parable be a way forward for the church to embrace the unproductivity of people with disabilities, and also to see in that a way to thrive? Now, it is very difficult in the end to escape our captivity to productivity. Even as I think about CRIP resistance, mutual need, unproductive being as undoing, I still want to move towards what all these things will do for us. What can they accomplish? Will they work? I suppose it depends on what we hope will be worked out, what we want to get done. Bray suggests that to be CRIP is to be unwilling to come back together as part of a productive whole, when coming together strengthens the system that abjected you in the first place. If we hope that what will happen is the undoing of the system that privileges ableness and productivity, perhaps the insistence on valuing those who do nothing or do nothing for us is the only way to get anything done at all. Bray suggests that there is a power in resistance or in absence of action that brings us into a new way of becoming together. Perhaps change might come if we begin thinking of ourselves as all predominantly disabled, reliant on one another always, with only temporary moments of ableness. Surely living in this way is to live in grace, is it not? Now, the internal dissonance I experience when I propose an unproductive God might be from my internal Pelagius. Won't the world fall apart if we stop working? Isn't it lazy or sinful for me to let others do all the work? Won't people take advantage of this way of living and I'll have to take up all the slack? Yet does not our proclamation of grace actually pull us to live this way? I mentioned earlier that I have cognitive impairment or brain damage from COVID. In essence, for the 2 months immediately following COVID, and even now when I overexert myself, I literally can't think. I can't understand complex sentences, remember what someone said to me just a moment before in a conversation, follow a train of thought, or write. Functionally, when this happens, I can't participate in meetings, I can't teach, I can't research, I can't write. As a scholar, I can't do any of the things that determine my productivity and hence my worth as a scholar. And naturally, I wonder what would happen if this became permanent. What would I do? When I have what I have been calling a brain damage flare up, I have to lie on my sofa and just lie there. I become a couch potato, gazing out the window or watching what I used to call dumb TV shows. Although I was raised in true Protestant work ethic fashion, my dad used to say he was a recovering Mennonite, I have come to enjoy it. Don't tell anybody. Once I give in to the reality that I can't get anything done, I actually enjoy doing nothing. I enjoy just drifting in a cloud of being. And so I have come to wonder if, in addition to being purposefully unproductive, our resistance to the culture and theology of productivity is to instead live lives based on enjoyment. Bray suggests pleasure as a resistance to productivity, but I'm suggesting enjoyment or appreciation. In large part, because of what God does after God has created the world, after God has done something, as it were. If you remember, in our creation story, God creates something, and then God sees that it is good. Implied in this series of actions is that God takes the time to step back and appreciate what has been done. Appreciating is not a particularly productive act. It is somewhat passive. To appreciate, we have to pause and just take in what has happened or is happening. We become recipients of the action out there. We simply enjoy. And so I wonder if perhaps doing nothing, receiving support from others, and enjoying it is perhaps a path towards undoing our captivity to ableism and productivity in the church. In a congregation I once served, there was a person with a cognitive disability who did not understand the flow of the church service and would interrupt my words in the liturgy. I would say something and this person would call out, "Amen," where no amen was in the response. I would say the words of institution, and after "given for you," this person would call out, "Given for you." It was interruptive, to be sure. Some might say disruptive, but this person was full of joy. These responses were responses of joy. This person didn't do anything. They simply enjoyed what was happening. And I came to miss the Sundays when they were absent. And in fact, to wish that everyone else was a little bit less able to adhere to the flow of the liturgy, a little bit less inclined to do what we were supposed to do in worship, and a little bit more inclined to simply enjoy being with one another in the presence of God, who likewise enjoys being with us. Now, lest we all think that I have somehow just produced theological reflection for all of us, I want to end by actually inviting everyone into breakout groups before we move into the traditional Q&A. So let's take maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I will actually let the organizers determine how long. But we'll reflect on the questions that are in the chat, the breakout questions that are hopefully going to show up. They'll show up in the chat soon.